Hello, everyone, and welcome to COSIN's webinar on cyber physical security systems in schools. We're very happy to have you all with us here today. One moment. Can I get control of the slides? Thank you. If you're not familiar with COSIN, we are the premier professional association for district technology leaders, and we provide leaders with the management, community building, and advocacy tools they need to succeed. We are very fortunate today to have four fantastic presenters to join us in conversation. The format today will involve me giving a little bit of an overview about cyber physical security systems, and then I'm going to ask some questions of these leading technology leaders who will share with us their experience and their knowledge. We have Ryan Cloutier, who is a principal security architect at CISSP. He is a seasoned IT security professional with over 15 years of experience, who has held a variety of IT roles, including multiple architect and security roles. Ryan's approach of empowering security through user convenience helps organizations adopt strong security practices with a minimal amount of disruption. We have Deborah Kettering, who is a CETL and the Chief Information Officer for Rockwood School District, which serves more than 21,000 students in suburban St. Louis, Missouri. Her current responsibilities include strategic planning, instructional technology, information security, physical security, and oversight of teams led by a director of technical support and coordinator of information systems. We have Colleen McNeil, who is the Director of Information Technology at St. Stephen's and St. Agnes, an independent K-12 school in Alexandria, Virginia. She leads the continued development of an innovative, robust, and secure information technology environment throughout the school, including learning management systems, student information systems, web services, and business software. And finally, we have Derek Root, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools. He came to CMS from Washington County Public Schools in Maryland, where he was also the Chief Technology Officer. Prior to this position, he served as the Director of Technology and Infrastructure for Frederick County Public Schools in Maryland, and he has also served as a program manager with the Presidio Corporation, overseeing IT security operations at the Department of Homeland Security, as well as supporting various federal, educational, and enterprise-class commercial clients. So a little bit about cyber physical security systems. These are systems that have physical components that are intended to secure the schools. So it includes things like access control, where you're talking about locks and gates and vestibules, where you may have vestibules, for instance, built of bulletproof glass to increase safety, or vestibules that are enhanced with shatterproofing film. You may have metal detectors. You may have door barriers. You may have entry cards where districts will issue ID cards to provide a visual indication of who is authorized to be in the building. There are also smart ID cards, which show not only a name and picture, but may include a chip that can be used together with a reader to identify where students are in the event of an emergency, as well as provide access to specific staff to doors that have been automatically locked down. There may also be, instead of entry cards, biometric readers, where tools such as fingerprint scanners may be used to identify staff and students, track their locations, and provide access during a lockdown. Access control may also include access software that can be used to track whether a visitor has been to the school before, if they're authorized to be at the school, print out visitor cards, check databases for registered sex offenders. There may be facial recognition software associated with this, or a central lockdown capability where integrated security systems can automatically trigger a school lockdown when events are detected, such as an alarm going off, a gunshot being detected, or a panic button activated. There are also surveillance systems, such as video cameras and face and object recognition software. There's integrated communications. There are any number of communication systems that can be used to keep first responders in the loop and keep staff and the district office in the loop when an event happens. There are communication systems that include the use of social media to inform parents, the community, and the press of ongoing status during and after an event. And there are communication systems that are integrated with sensors and actuators in order to be able to automatically initiate a lockdown and then share information with district leadership, student parents, and responders. Of course, alarms and sensors are an important part. Alarms such as door alarms or panic button alarms. Door sensors so that you know if doors have been opened or windows have been opened. Gunshot detectors and others. There are also more modern systems such as fogging and pepper spray systems that will create a smoke screen when an intruder enters, and these are often put in vestibules, although there is a risk that these systems can hamper responder operations, so they are not always supported by responders. And finally, attendance and check-in apps are used by a lot of districts so that they can track and make sure they know where students are in the event of an emergency. Now, these systems actually have both physical and technological components. And so they have an impact on your networks and systems. One thing to keep in mind is network bandwidth. What kind of bandwidth is required for these cyber physical systems? Traditionally, video has been considered a very high bandwidth applications, especially if there are many cameras streaming continually, although that has been mitigated significantly by improved compression algorithms available in modern cameras and by only saving real-time recording where there is activity or a trigger, such as a door opening. A lot of districts support network segregation so that and quality of service so that cyber physical devices have priority in the event of any kind of security situation. And of course, security itself becomes a very significant component. The security of these networks that are often elements that are considered things such as the Internet of Things, cameras, buttons, and so forth, traditionally may not have the same kind of security provisions that the network does. So looking at those, making sure that passwords are changed, that patches are kept up to date, that all security equipment has a management console and that console is using HTTPS, not HTTP. Another consideration is third-party access. So the vendors that sell these equipment sometimes have backdoors or mechanisms for being able to access this equipment, and that can be a consideration. And so it's important when talking with vendors to make sure we understand how they protect against unauthorized access of the devices. And finally, of course, data management becomes a more important consideration when you're starting to look at things like biometric data and when you're collecting video and you need to have procedures and processes that identify what you need to do for data archiving. There may be state and legal requirements for that as well as with having student data, such as biometric data. How do you protect that data, and what kind of reporting are you required to do on that data? So that is just a very brief overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about cyber physical security systems. And what I'd like to do now is to move on to allow our expert panelists to share their experience in response to a number of questions. And the first question I have for the four of you is, why are these cyber physical security systems important? Who would like to start?
Brian here. I can go first. The cyber physical systems are important because they are the physical line of defense that we use to keep the children physically safe. A lot of times we don't necessarily think about them in the context of their digital components, but the cyber physical systems are very important because that is our first line of physical safety for the children.
And Ryan, I think I can add on to that a bit, that it's safety for our children, safety for our staff as well, as they're concerned with children. So in any event where both cyber and physical security are important, then we need the staff to be acting in a manner where they feel that they're being supported, watched, managed by our systems as well too, so they can focus on the event or events that they're dealing with directly.
Colleen or Deborah, do you have anything to add?
I think this also has a component of allowing us to be prepared and organized and ready for situations when they occur, and hopefully to mitigate some risk by having the alerting features and some of the other things that are available by adding that cyber component to, or digital component to the physical security. But I agree with, especially with what Ryan said, these are our first lines of defense. So the door locks, those things are really our first line of defense for safety and securing our buildings.
I think it's the number one factor that parents are looking for when they are looking at a school. It's the most important thing to parents is that their children are safe.
Thank you. Next question. Tell us about what you have implemented and what's working well and what isn't.
Well, Marie, I can start on that. We've done a bunch of implementations here at Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and we continue with the latest cutting-edge technologies that we can discover and deploy. I think one of our first layers of defense is a visitor management system that we use to check all visitors into the building, so we know who's in what building and when. That visitor management system also checks against, the typical sex offender databases and that sort of thing. It doesn't do full-on criminal investigations, but the stuff that you can do quickly to get people through the buildings. And just this year, we've required all schools, all people entering the building that aren't individual staff members of that school, including myself and our superintendent, we've all made the pledge that we would sign in and out of those systems as we came and went. Secondly, we have the typical security cameras that you would find in just about any building, and I think just about everybody sees that. It's ubiquitous anymore. But the latest things we've been implementing, piloting, and moving into deployment to all of our high schools are systems with cameras in the classrooms that serve a dual role. The teachers can activate them and use them for their own purposes, but we can also jump to those from our security staff. The minute there's an incident going on in a classroom, the teachers can activate the camera quickly using their badge, and it takes a snapshot of what's going on, sends it to the appropriate people, and then begins recording what's going on in that classroom. Tied with that now, what's going into our high schools is a series of beacons that will be deployed to all high schools throughout this year. Those beacons can flash in up to, I want to say, about 7 different colors based on the type of alert that we've sent through. All staff members, again, have a badge with a button they can push. So let me just give some examples where if there's an incident where you need to lock down the school, you just start pushing that button and you hit as many times as you can, and it'll turn the beacons red, which will automatically throw the school into lockdown and notify the proper authorities as to exactly where you are when you push that button. So by having people push it 7 or 8 or 9 times, it helps prevent, accidental lockdowns. But say there's just a minor thing that you need help with in your area. It could be a health alert or some, scuffle between students. You can hit the button once or twice, and it will fire off that alert. Maybe turn the beacons purple instead of red, and alert the appropriate authorities along the way. So those are examples of a couple of things we're doing here in Charlotte, along with the typical hardening of doors and vestibules and visitor access systems that I think everybody sort of already knows about.
Great, thank you. Who would like to talk next?
This is Colleen. We also have visitor management, access control systems with fobs and fingerprint readers, video surveillance, lockdowns, things that are not going as smoothly as I would like. We definitely had some pushback on the biometric
fingerprint scans, and then the license plate scanning. We're doing that recognition on when drivers come on campus, and that has not quite been configured perfectly yet.
Thank you. Deb?
So we're doing a lot of the same things. And one of the situations we have is trying to walk that fine line between being secure and as a parent put it, being a prison. And so we've really struggled with and worked through what does that look like in our district. And in some cases, we've actually opted to stick with physical only solutions, which may or may not be the best overall decision, but it served a couple purposes. And the other thing, we talk a lot about equity in our district. And one of the things that we identified was that we have surveillance cameras in every building, but we didn't have a standard for those surveillance cameras. We didn't have a standard for what should be covered, what shouldn't be covered. So we have looked into that more, and we created a standard in cooperation with our schools and some parents, our safety committee. And now we are in the process of developing an implementation strategy, and knowing that funding is difficult, that it's going to take up to 5 years to get all of our schools just to that same basic standard. So that's one area where we're probably behind some other schools, but we're trying to pick those things that we feel will give us the most bang for our buck and equity. We have an intruder alert system that we devised in conjunction with our intercom system and our voice over IP system. And we have buttons on all of our phones that will activate the intruder alert. It does not automatically lock down the school. There are other functions, other systems in place that have to be activated for that, but this does make a quick alert and provide information to people. It also can trigger a strobe, a beacon type light in certain areas where there are a lot of students congregating, for example, the commons or gyms. And as everyone else said, we have different access control systems and requirements for signing in. That I'm not sure who said it, but the fact that everyone from the superintendent all the way down to students and visitors have committed to actually signing in so we know who's in our buildings at all times was made this year also.
Great, thank you, Deb. Here's another question. So cyber-physical security may sometimes fall under facilities, it may fall under IT, but really, who is it who should have oversight for cyber-physical security, and why?
This is Debbie. I think it really belongs to, and everyone's too broad of a term, but I think every department probably has some need to be at the table for discussions, maybe not the actual implementation, but we as the technology department and or the facilities department really need to understand the needs of all of those other teams and people so that we can tailor what we're doing to meet those needs. And in our district, we have a safety committee, which started out as a risk assessment committee for financial purposes of facilities and insurance. And so technology has been a part of that committee now for about 6 years. And last week we had the discussion that we really have to become more strategic, and we have to have more than just those 3 groups at the table to effectively determine what it is we need, when we need it, and how we're going to pay for it and implement it.
Great, thank you. Colleen, do you have anything to add?
In our school, the cyber physical security system oversight is shared by technology and facilities, and we really have to work together. That technology needs to be consulted when it comes to setting up the systems and figuring out how best to integrate them into the systems that we currently have in place. And then our facilities team is responsible for sort of monitoring and daily use of those systems. And I feel like that integration piece is a really big challenge that a lot of schools are facing. We're trying to, we call it yet another database to maintain, YADM. We're trying to reduce our YADM and have as many systems that link together as possible so that we don't have redundancy and difficulty in maintenance and greater possibility of error.
Great, thank you. Derek.
Well, to air out my dirty laundry a little bit, I will say that we're much in the same boat where a lot of the cyber or physical security is shared amongst facilities, tech, and I'm not sure how unique we are here in Charlotte, but we actually have our own police force within the school district. These are badged, uniformed officers that work for the school district, though, and so they share a component as well, too. So from a monitoring perspective, that CMS police force manages all of our security cameras, for instance. They monitor them. They have a small operations center. They can get into any of those systems. I have that system directly integrated with our Charlotte police force, Mecklenburg police force, so they can actually access those cameras as we need them to as well, which has been a great asset for a whole bunch of reasons that I don't want to go into today. But from a management perspective, what I'll say is having the 3 different groups isn't working very well. I'll use our visitor management system as a prime example. As we have ramped up usage of that system over the last year, it became readily apparent that it wasn't being properly monitored, maintained, or configured. You could go into any one of our 177 schools and you might find 177 different configurations of that thing where the local schools have been given the ability to administer it, so they would have different types of visitors that could come and go, and maybe they didn't have, we have a volunteer management database with pre-vetted volunteers, so if you're volunteering, just click that button and quickly get into the school. Some schools had it, some didn't, so it really wasn't working. So I went on a goodwill tour this summer to kind of wrest control of that away, and it wasn't a difficult job because everybody was anxious to give it up. Control of that system, but we're looking at our other systems and seeing the same thing because of, I forget who said it a minute ago, funding sources came from different places. At one point in time, the county funded some money to upgrade securities in schools, and so facilities was given the money. It was a capital type project. And another time it might have been given to the CMS police force, and they came in and funded as a police force driven project. IT may have come in and said, oh, we're going to do this project. And so we had different owners for different things. So I think it's important as people develop cyber physical security that someone takes ownership of it. Depending on which direction of the cyber and physical it leans more towards, maybe that'll help you make that decision. In our case, like I said, visitor management made more sense for IT to be managing that system than anybody because of the databases, because it relies on PCs, because it rides the network. That's important for us to manage. Probably the same thing with our sort of alerting system where you can push the button on your badges. That's generally going to be an IT-driven system, and maybe we'll use facilities and the CMS Police Department as a steering committee to help us ensure that we have a lot of voices there. But I will caution everybody to make sure and take a really good look at it, and don't just let the people who had the money for that given project become the owners, because over the long term, it very often fades from focus.
Great, thanks, Gary. Ryan, do you have some additional comments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work with a variety of districts, and all of our other speakers have touched on really valid points. I see a variety of systems in the districts I work with, everything from our metro areas that have metal detectors locking doors, out to our rural communities where it's more of a human-based security system, if you will. What I can tell you is having a cross-functional team with shared ownership is the best model. Security is not an IT problem. It is not a police problem. It is a community problem. It is a human issue. So having cross-functional members comprise an oversight committee. The most successful programs I've seen have a stakeholder from the superintendent's office, a stakeholder from the business manager's office. So we start talking about things like money. Law enforcement is generally represented. Buildings and grounds is represented, and IT is represented. And the districts that approach it as a holistic issue, as a student safety issue, and a student nourishing and learning issue, generally have the greatest degree of success, the lowest amount of who's on first, if you will, and they also tend to be able to get budget issues addressed very quickly. I just worked with a district last week that was really struggling. The state of Minnesota opened up some new funding for vestibules and doors, but they didn't provide the funding for the necessary network upgrade to support these fancy new door locks. And so they were very concerned about what to do. And it was that district was treating it as an IT problem. When we connected them with their crisis management team, we found there was extra money in the crisis budget that they could then use to upgrade the network. So my takeaway for everyone on this is the more cross-functional you can make it, the better. And the higher up you can place the ownership, the more effective the program tends to be.
Great, thanks everyone. Next question, and this is a big one. How do you pay for cyber physical security?
Marie, we do it a couple different ways here, and I think I mentioned most of them in my previous statements, where we have either pulled it from existing operating budget in one department or another. But I would say the last two big rounds of upgrades that we've done to our district have both been part of, and this is really to Ryan's point, a partnership at the highest level, then beyond the school district, where we have partnered with our own internal police force, our local Mecklenburg police force, and our county leadership in the form of county commissioners and our manager to look at security upgrades. We had one little boon when the DNC was here, and now we've got the RNC coming, and that'll probably add a little bit, which is kind of neat and helpful. But most people won't have that sort of opportunity. So we go back and we explain to local county leadership, this is what we need. And in this particular year, we went back and asked for a fairly large chunk of money to come back through and do some security work. And we got about half of it, which is not what we had hoped for, but we're going to be able to get a lot done with the half of what we asked for, at least coming in. And it will help us do some funding that's beyond the onesie twosie projects, where we can look at things as a whole district. And in a smaller district where I've worked before, it was a little bit easier to do than it is in a really, really large one like this one. But it's important to work with local elected officials as well as your internal departments in order to find funding for that type of work.
Great, thanks. Who else has some insight?
So in Rockwood, I agree. We try to reach out to our local community. We work closely with, we're much smaller. We have 7 municipalities that we deal with. So we work with those municipalities and try to get whatever support we can from them. We look for grants. I've applied for several grants. We also utilize bonds to pay for large capital expenditures, and that's how technology is currently funded, and that's how a lot of our facilities expenditures are also funded. So they come from that. We don't have a lot of flexibility with our operations budgets. Those are pretty set. We have to have a balanced budget and typically no increase in expenditures in those budgets. So we're always trying to find ways that we can either augment what we're doing with grants or other sources of funding, but also just doing things. We've done a lot of things in-house that we've seen elsewhere as a purchase solution. For example, our visitor management system, we have SharePoint. We had our SharePoint developer said, you know what? I think I could do what that visitor management system is doing that one school's PTO paid for. I think I could do that for our whole district. And so we just this year finished the implementation of that district-wide, where we have it set up so students can check in and out. But, we utilized old laptops that we would have just been obsoleting to be the check-in station. So there are ways that we try to reduce what we're paying for outside so that those things that we are buying, that we do need to contract for or purchase separately, we have funds available for that.
Thanks, Debbie. Ryan or Colleen?
Yeah, Ryan here. I think, what I've heard is consistent with what I see. The one thing that a couple of my districts have done is community fundraisers. So really, again, getting it back to that community issue, get mom and dad involved. I have a district that's a little bit more affluent, and in that district, they solved the problem because one of the more well-to-do parents just cut a check. But, reach out into the community as well. There's a lot more money available for this if we talk about it in the terms of safety. And there's different funding sources, and depending on your local laws and what you're allowed to do with private sector in relation to partnerships. I know of several private sector companies that have grant programs available that will donate physical security systems. I won't mention them by name, but there's a really big physical security company that starts with a T. And so if you Google that, they have a little known program where they do donate as well. But short of that, it's kind of the same battle. Talk to the crisis team, make it a multidiscipline issue. There might be another team within your district that has some funding.
Colleen, do you have any additional thoughts?
I think what I would say is
All right, a little bit of an echo there, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question, this is a kind of a fraught question. How much should you spend on cyber physical security? And what are some of the considerations there?
This is Derek. I don't know if I can give you a set dollar figure or even a percentage per se on what you should spend on physical security. I think, again, much to Ryan's point, you have to look at your situation, and you have to look at each facility and pay attention to it. No two of our buildings are really the same, except for some of the more modern buildings. But if you come onto my high school campuses, they here in Charlotte are truly campuses. In a lot of cases, we have 4, 5, 7 buildings on a high school campus, and kids are moving around outdoors. I'm sure just about everybody on the line has portables on their campuses, and you have to think about those in a different way. Again, you don't want that prison feel, so you can't have a bunch of portables with a chain link fence around them. That's not going to work well. So I think you have to look at each situation individually and make a determination on what it should cost. In one instance, I've been able to make some changes that didn't cost much of anything, where we had a lot of portables on a maxed out campus in a town. And in that place, these elementary school kids were coming and going because there was no restroom facility in the portable. Well, that's a security issue where you have to send multiple kids or you have to send a staff member. So we repurposed cameras, repointed them, and gave access to the teachers in the individual portables so they could see their students coming and going. It sounds minor, but it brought a whole new level of security to those kids that are coming and going from the school, just doing a simple thing like visiting the restroom. So that didn't cost a dime other than a few minutes of a couple of different engineers' time. It did take collaboration between facilities, tech, and security, though. We had to get access to those cameras, we had to put players on their monitors, and we had to get facilities people to readjust and repoint. So there was no money spent there at all. Now, addressing our high schools and putting in an alert system so all staff members can do it, that's sort of almost a non-negotiable for my boss here, and he really wants to see this happen. So that's one of those, well, we're going to spend some money on that, and we realize we have to do 30 high schools, and we're going to have to budget for that. So, we're going to look at a 7-figure spend to get that done. There's just really no way around it. So that's where again, what Ryan said earlier, we have to come together as a district, and everybody has to pull a little bit of money here and there out of what little discretionary funds they have to make sure it happens. And then again, we were fortunate enough to have our county support with that. And that really was through a very long goodwill drive that we did through the community. We held events all over Mecklenburg County, which is 550 square miles of area, and we had leadership go out and talk to the community about why this was important, so that the community notified their local leadership notified county leadership, and it was a grassroots sort of an effort to make sure that security was brought to the forefront of everyone's attention without the fear mongering to go along with it. We just are informing instead of trying to frighten everybody into paying for it.
Great, thank you, Derek. Any other comments?
I agree. I think it's difficult to put an exact percentage or dollar amount on it. And my notes for this, I had said, it really depends on what the financial constraints are in your district and what your community prioritizes, as well as what you as a school system prioritize. We solicit a lot of feedback from our families, and so we really take that into consideration as we're making those decisions.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. And so this is a really pragmatic one. Do you have advice when it comes to evaluating a CPS vendor?
This is Ryan here. I'll take this first. You should be looking quite aggressively at your CPS vendors. What you want to ensure is that they have skin in the game with you, and that they're not doing anything that could potentially increase your risk or reduce your safety. So for example, and I'm not sure who mentioned it earlier, but CPS vendors a lot of times want to make their life easy. So they'll make a recommendation that you leave a default credential in place so their support staff can easily log in. you should challenge that vendor and say, no, we will use unique credentials that we can track and manage. Be very cautious of anyone selling silver bullets, magic oil, fairy dust. These things don't exist. And really the main question is in this partnership we're forming together, how committed are you to having skin in the game with us? You know, what happens when your system fails and then that results in an issue? You know, understand what's in your contract. You know, work with your legal counsel before you decide this is the right vendor for you to do business with. All too many times, security issues happen as a result of vendors wanting things to be convenient. The most famous one is Target. That was an HVAC vendor that wanted convenience, and that resulted in Target being compromised. I just dealt with a vendor 2 weeks ago in the cyber physical space that wanted to upgrade the door controllers for the school. That vendor was pushing very hard that their default credentials be left in place for their support staff. And I was ultimately brought in to negotiate with that vendor to get that undone. So to recap that, look at the vendor, you know, do they have a good reputation? How willing are they to negotiate with you? How willing are they to, you know, take on risk with you since you're putting all your trust in their system? What assurances are they providing? And ultimately then, you know, look at the contract terms. A lot of things get hidden in the contract terms.
Thanks, Ryan. Who would like to speak next?
This is Colleen. I would also say that it's really important to check, research the company and find out about its financial stability. We've been caught by that in the past. And I find it incredibly helpful to ask for references for IT in other similar schools and talk to those people about implementation issues, because sometimes sales are not fully informed or not entirely transparent about issues that may have arisen in the past. And that's where connections through an organization like COSIN can be really valuable.
Thanks, Colleen. Derek or Deb, do you have something to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think I think she was right on the money when surveying for us. Like, I often go to the Council of Great City Schools, or I go to COSIN and talk to you all about what are some preferred vendors, maybe even before I get started. Here locally in North Carolina, we have a listserv, and I know this is true in a lot of states. I know we had it in Maryland as well too when I was there. Of the local districts and reaching out to them. Who do you recommend? Who have you used? Who have you worked with? And if at all possible, get out and go explore a little bit. You know, I'm 3 hours from Atlanta, and you know, Georgia has done a lot of forward-thinking stuff around this subject. So I've been down touring schools in Gwinnett County and Newton County and Fulton down there, looking at what they've done from a security perspective, and in other respects too. This kind of applies to a lot of things we do in general. But yeah, looking at our professional organizations, looking at our peers, looking at our neighbors, I think are some of the three biggest things I can say before you even get started evaluating your vendors, because then you can look for that bespoke solution that works in your district.
And just to wrap that up, I fully agree with everything that was said. One of the things our Missouri chapter of COSIN did was establish a checklist of items that we've shared amongst ourselves, of things to include or evaluate as requirements for an RFP. So a lot of those very same things that you guys discussed, but I find it helpful to have that checklist in front of me as I'm either writing an RFP or reviewing a contract, just to make sure that I don't forget something. And so that would be a tip from me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Next question. Since budget is always going to be a concern, what are the top few things that are most important to invest in?
It's Derek here. I think it really depends on where you are. You know, if you don't have, say, the ability to lock the front doors of your school, and right now they're just open, then that's super low hanging fruit. You can go right after that and put in a buzzer system at its most basic thing. If you've already gotten past that hurdle and you've already got security cameras in, then I think it really takes a good long look at your community and your facilities to see what it's like. You know, what works for me in an inner city school isn't necessarily going to work for me out in a rural school. And I have everything from either end and in between here, and I know a lot of people do. So I think you have to look at what level you're in and decide where to start, what the level of risk is in that building. You know, what the level of security is for that building, how many spaces you have, you know, are classrooms exterior, interior? I mean, there's so many questions along the way, but I think you go after the low-hanging fruit first, which is your basic physical cyber systems like automatic door locks where you can hit buttons to unlock. Camera systems are something everybody wants to invest in as well too. I think one thing that we haven't mentioned a whole lot of today that we should look to invest in as well is just general training as well too. Like, once you have these systems in place, who uses them, how are they used, what's the most effective use? So I think professional development around whatever you have in place is a super important thing to invest in as well.
Thanks, Derek. Would anyone like to add to that? All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. So, what are some of the most critical systems, and what happens if they fail? What kind of backup planning should you be doing?
This is Ryan here. I think, you know, we want to make sure that those super critical systems, so again, physical security, right? Keeping the doors locked generally is number one. We want to make sure that there's appropriate redundancy around those safety systems. While the surveillance cameras are really helpful, they aren't stopping an intruder. So focus first, in my opinion, focus first on those critical security elements, things that could be misused, door locks being opened, fog systems being set off at an inappropriate time or reason, you know, things that could hamper the efforts of first responders. Look at those things first and make sure you have appropriate systems around them. I'll tell anybody, and this goes for any critical system, cyber, physical, or otherwise, back it up daily, store the backup on a computer other than the computer you made the backup on. Those two things alone are going to increase your recovery and redundancy posture significantly. If you do have a system that fails completely, the best thing you can do is preparedness. So go through an exercise on paper and say, what happens when? So we can't lock the doors. What's our backup plan? Ideally, this should be done in conjunction with your crisis management team and any first responders that you might do crisis planning with.
Great, thank you. Would anyone like to add to that?
I think one of the most critical systems is communications, that a lot of other things can go wrong, and as long as you can still communicate with your team, you can address those. So it's really important to have a multi-layered approach to communications and practice with those different systems so that when one of them is unavailable, people still know how to communicate with others.
Very good point.
Yeah, I think they were both right on. I don't know if I have a whole lot I can add to those wise strategies we already heard.
I agree with all of that, and I do think that Ryan's point about training and Derek's points about training earlier, we're right on with this as well, because we have some things implemented for backups for our phone systems because we're voice over IP. So if we have a wide area network outage, or as we had last year with AT&T, a 2-day outage, a local power outage. We have things in place because of those situations that have come up previously. We have things in place that will allow us to adapt and at least have communication systems, phones available in our offices. And the key piece for that is training. So when new principals come into a building, that's one of the things that my team does, is meets with them to ensure that they know where the backup phone is, how they get their hotspot turned on, all those kinds of things. And to Ryan's point also, I think backups are critical. And we actually have a DR site that we back up our most critical systems to, and we have a 4 to 6 hour restore time. And tabletop exercises are always valuable.
Great, thank you. So I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but how have you found that these physical systems have affected your network? And are there any particular measures you've had to take to support that?
I don't think we've had to take a wide variety of network type infrastructure changes to support the physical systems. We have been steadily growing and you did mention a couple of these in the beginning with cameras and things, caching locally and only sending information up when there's movement and all these different technologies that have come in there to manage bandwidth. But it's only been in recent, and when I say recent, I mean in the last few months, that we've even looked at increasing our network infrastructure. And really only in some of my high schools am I starting to see the fiber optic infrastructure, linking them together and back to the district, starting to get busy. And so when I start seeing 70 and 80% utilization, I'll start taking a look at it and using some of those areas to upgrade. But really, we haven't seen a lot of changes to our network. The technology is keeping up with itself. Network speeds are pretty good, so not a ton there. I know in your next question, I don't want to steal your thunder. There's some things to be considered when you're doing work, but from what's in place today, we're not seeing a whole lot of major effects.
Does anyone have a different experience or anything to add?
This is Ryan here. The thing that I'll add is while we don't see a whole lot of degradation in overall network bandwidth, network isolation and segmentation is very important. We do notice with our schools that are starting to teach hacking classes, a lot more activity on those networks. And due to the critical nature of them, the recommendation that we at Sourcewell give to all of our districts is those networks should be completely isolated and preferably not even internet accessible. And that can be a bit of a challenge because you have to design an update program instead of just, following the vendor's advice. It says open a port in the firewall and we'll update it always. So the idea is to really isolate those networks to reduce their attack surface, both from the outside world and the inside world.
Great, thank you. And our final question is, when you're starting from scratch, if you're building a new building, what physical security design considerations are important?
Yeah, that's kind of the thunder I didn't want to steal from you on the next slide. So again, I'm not a physical security expert, so I can't tell you from a complete expert on building design perspective, but I can tell you that in practice, things like visitor management, how do you flow people in and out of your building? So I spent the first few days working in a fairly new elementary school this year. We always deploy ourselves throughout the district to support new schools, or the opening of schools. And this particular building is only about 5 years old, but in order for visitors to check in, they had to come and go from the front office, which was on the right-hand side of a long hallway, and there was one main door in and out of the front office. So on opening day of an elementary school, if any of you have been there, there are hundreds and hundreds of parents coming and going from the building, and it's just not feasible to get them all through this bottleneck of the front office. So I think physically, as we're designing schools, to start thinking a little bit more about how are we going to flow a large number of people through this building, in a sense more like people have a semblance of security in place. So that's important. And then to Ryan's point in the earlier question, is that network segmentation is critical. You want to keep like your badge readers on a separate system, on a separate network than your regular network traffic. And if you can segment things out like that, especially in CTE classes and things like that, for sure, that's not so much physical. But I think the biggest piece of advice I can give is looking at sight lines, looking at traffic flow, and just generally making sure that you can get people through a building and see them where they are in the building. You don't have blind spots in the building, that sort of thing.
We're building a new elementary and a new significant addition to a high school. And one of the things that we noticed as we were meeting with the architects, we had competing priorities. Their priority was to make the building look and feel welcoming and comfortable. And to Derek's point, the way the traffic was flowing wasn't really conducive to security. And again, I'm not a security expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I know that if you've got 1,000 people coming through a door in 15 minutes, it's going to get a log jam. And so those were some discussions we had with our architects. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I don't know if other states have this, but Missouri is asking districts to include storm shelters that will survive an F4, F5 tornado. And one of the things that we've been talking about is, as we build those, that's where our MDF should go. And some of that high value equipment that we want to protect as a way to help our schools come back online more quickly.
Thank you. So we've only got a minute or two left, but are there any questions that we can answer before we go? If so, please go ahead and type them into the chat. And while we're waiting for that, I also want to let you know that COSIN will be publishing 2 new cyber-physical security resources. One will be published tomorrow, and one will be coming out within the next couple of weeks. So please keep an eye out for that. I also want to invite you to the upcoming COSIN conference, April 1st through 4th, Envision 2030, where we'll be focusing what the world will look like as the class of 2030 leaves our education system. This is a fabulous conference for when you're able to attend, partly because there is very high quality and interesting programming, but also because there's such a high caliber of attendees that that the networking and ability to make other connections and learn from each other is just a fantastic opportunity. I also want to make sure that we thank our sponsors and corporate partners. Before we go, without them, this work would not be possible. And we do have a question, which is, what do you think about cell phone repeaters within a building? Who would like to take that?
Hey, Marie, I'll take that one because I've been fighting that very issue lately, especially in some of our older buildings that are concrete and steel and not as many windows. We've looked at that. I haven't invested in them because we don't provide cell phones to enough staff members for me to feel like they're worth the investment and the cost of putting them in and maintaining them. So we have looked at other technologies like wireless calling and Wi-Fi calling, that sort of thing for people. But really, we didn't see cell phone repeaters, except for in a very few rare occasions, as a worthwhile investment.
This is Ryan here. Talk to the telco providers. In Minnesota, all cell repeaters are provided at no cost to our district by T-Mobile, by AT&T. They want a footprint. They know the parents want cell service. A lot of times they're willing to give you the equipment at no charge. I think that having, that as a redundant can be helpful in a crisis situation, but it's definitely not mandatory. But definitely reach out to your local cell phone providers. A lot of times they have free programs available.
This is Debbie. To piggyback on Ryan, I had a grant from Verizon that was valued at over $300,000 to put cell repeaters in one of our high schools as a safety initiative, because it was a publicly available grant that I applied for, but that made life in that school much better because they did not have any service once you were inside the building. But like Derek, we have not done that in our schools, other places, just simply because of trying to balance the cost of that with the benefit.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to reiterate my thanks to Colleen, Debbie, Derek, and Ryan. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your knowledge and your expertise. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. And I think that is the conclusion of our presentation today. And everyone have a terrific rest of the day and rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you.